This is the Treasury of Common Sense. Leith, g'day.
G'day, Trent. How are you?
I'm really well, mate. How are you? I think we've got a lot to talk about, and I will just hand over to you, and you can get the ball rolling, my friend.
Oh, thanks, mate. Yeah, look, obviously we got the mid-year economic and fiscal update this week, and, you know, people are probably expecting me to talk about the budget figures, the deficit, all that sort of stuff. But the thing I want to actually focus on is the area that was basically gleaned over by the media. It wasn't really talked about. And it's the blowout in net overseas migration that came out of the mid-year economic and fiscal update. So just to give you a quick bit of history, when the Albanese government was elected, its first budget, it had a mini budget in October 2022, a couple of months after it got elected. And a forecast that Australia's net overseas migration would be 470,000 over the first two financial years. So we're talking about the 2023 and 2024 financial years. What ended up happening is, as we know, we got record immigration. They actually delivered more than double the number of net overseas migration. So we got, according to the official data that came out a week or so ago from the ABS, instead of being 470,000 as projected, we got 981,300 net migrants arriving in the first two financial years. Now, the May federal budget of this year forecast that net overseas migration will be 260,000 for the current financial year, so the one that we're in, financial year 2025. But then Wednesday's mid-year and economic and fiscal update that came out this week has upgraded that forecast now by 80,000 to 340,000. So every single federal budget and every single budget update that has been released under this government since it was elected has been massively underestimated Australia's net overseas migration. So for financial year 2023, so going back a few years, its initial forecast was 235,000. We ended up getting 535,500. For financial year 2024, the Albanese government initially projected 215,000. It ended up being 446,000. And for this financial year, its initial forecast was 260,000. It's ended up being 340,000. So basically, you know, this government has lost control of immigration, is my point. And Treasurer Jim Chalmers' explanation for the latest migration blowout was akin to the dog ate my homework. So he basically said that net overseas migration is going to be higher because temporary migrants are remaining in Australia for longer. So they're not going home.
On that point, Leith, just before you go on, we did have a message asking that question. I was just scrolling through. We got so many messages this morning, but people asking why that many people have been let in and that nobody's focusing on it. But here you are focusing on it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is the thing that's been glossed over. So everyone talks about the budget deficit and all that sort of stuff. And look, I myself, I've done 4 interviews this week on that topic. But this is the area which very few people seem to focus on. So once again, we're getting a blowout in net overseas migration. The Albanese government has missed its target by a long shot. Treasurer Jim Chalmers says that it's because migrants are staying for longer. He's partly right. So, you know, annual migrant departures in the last financial year, so the most recent data was down by about 88,000 from the 2019 level, which is pre-pandemic. But here's the thing. The migrant arrivals was up by nearly 120,000 from the same period. So the blowout's still being caused primarily by excessive arrivals. And besides, it's pretty much irrelevant, you know, whether it's because too many are coming in or fewer are leaving. It's driven by government policy and government incentives, and it still shows that they're failing to control immigration. So the main reason why migrants aren't leaving the country is because we've got a record number of bridging visas. Now, what those are visas that are handed out to migrants who, say, try and claim asylum. So what happens is when their visa runs out, they don't want to leave, they then try and claim asylum or they try and claim some other thing. It ends up going to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. Actually, I think it's called the Administrative Review Tribunal. They've just changed the name. And then they end up in this sort of on a bridging visa for years while the Ministry of Review Tribunal has to work out the case to see if it's legitimate, etc. So the number of bridging visas has skyrocketed by 130,000.
Well, that's huge.
Since the start of the pandemic.
Yep.
So basically that tells you, and we're seeing this a lot of the fake students who are basically trying to claim asylum now, which is one of the reasons for that blowout. So that there is a loss of control of immigration. Secondly, the federal government itself, and this happened also under the previous government, has made it much easier and made it much more attractive for international students to to transition on a graduate visas once they finish their courses. They've opened that up to more courses. They've extended the length of graduate visas, etc. And as a result, the number of graduate visas has also increased by 130,000 since the start of the pandemic. So the blowout in bridging visas, the blowout in graduate visas are two of the reasons why we've got less temporary migrants leaving the country. They're staying here for longer. And it's really because of, failed government policy and failed control over the migration system.
And it's not a bad place to live either, Leith, is it? Let's face it.
No, that's right.
Why would you want to leave once you're here? Just before we take a break for an ad, we've got a question here from Simon for you, Leith. Leith, what do you think about a responsible government raising the GST from 10 to 15% as a bipartisan approach? Do you think there's any reason to have that argument?
I think they should definitely do it, certainly, and especially in exchange for reduced income taxes. So I said last week that Australia has one of the most over-reliant tax systems on personal income taxes. They're currently at a record level in terms of percentage of income paid in income taxes, and it's projected to keep growing. And we're in this unsustainable situation whereby we have an ageing population. The share of workers in the economy is going to keep shrinking. Regardless of running the high immigration program, it's going to keep shrinking. So we're effectively slugging a shrinking share of the population with higher and higher taxes to fund all the things that we need. Yep. It'd be much better to just do a tax on consumption so everybody pays it. So if you're a retiree, you got to pay it. If you're a worker, you're a non-worker, you got to pay it. And some people will say, that's unfair on people who are on job seeker or the age pension or low income earners. You can adjust those accordingly to make sure that those people are no worse off. But I think that's a very good idea to increase it to 15% in exchange for lower income taxes.
All right, Leith, it's 15 minutes past 11 in Sydney, 15 minutes past 10 in Brisbane. We'll take a break and then we'll come back and let Leith explain a pretty ugly forecast for some budget deficits. Trent Nikolic filling in for Luke Grant. Leith, a couple of messages by way of feedback for what you've been talking about. Margaret says, get rid of graduate visas. This is ridiculous. Jack is saying, in my opinion, universities have now become little more than visa factories. Hard to disagree with that, mate, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. Look, especially on the graduate visa thing. I mean, I don't understand why Australia pretty much automatically hands out graduate visas once you finish your course. It should be really restricted to the absolute best of the best. So, if you've completed a high-end course and you've got first-class honours, whatever, and you've done an excellent job, and your area is in the area of skill shortage, sure, give those people a graduate visa, but we just seem to hand them out like Tic Tacs. and as a result, we've got these ongoing population pressures. And the thing about it is, if you actually look at the data for graduate visas, and this came out in the migration review that was released last year by the federal government, it showed that 51% of people on graduate visas who'd been in the country for 3 years, so that's that's the ones who've remained, effectively, are working in unskilled jobs. So they're working as bartenders, cleaners, baristas, that sort of thing. So, this is supposed to be skilled people here who are doing a graduate visa, been here for 3 years. 51% of them, so just over half, are working in unskilled jobs.
Yeah. It's not
and
working.
That tells you that's right. It's not a skilled migration system that we're running. It's just a quantity system, trying to get the numbers up as high as possible. And really, the universities are just acting like greedy, profit-maximising corporations who are basically getting to, earn fat revenue from the migration, be middlemen to the migration system, while the cost, and they don't even pay tax on it. So universities don't even pay tax, so we don't get any benefit from it.
That's right.
Creating all sort of pressures in the rental market, etc., and the costs are basically deferred on private citizens. So, immigration's got to come down. The Albanese government has delivered a rental crisis by running an immigration program more than double what they projected. And it's got to stop. We are in a supply-constrained market where we cannot build enough houses because costs have gone up 40% since the pandemic. We've got shortages of builders. Lots of building companies have collapsed. So the logical solution when you've got a supply-constrained market is to constrain demand so that supply matches demand. Instead, the federal government has ramped up demand. And, so it's running well ahead of supply. And that's delivered us a rental crisis.
Ramp up demand and then wonder why supply can't keep up. Civ,
but then it's even worse than that, Trent. They then blame the supply side, saying, it's a supply problem.
Yeah,
it's a demand problem.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Civ's a regular listener to the show. He's sent in a message asking, Leith, whether you think that the Liberal government, if eventually we end up with another Liberal government anytime soon, will have to do a Donald Trump-style mass deportation of a lot of illegal immigrants, for example, and let the chips fall where they may. Is that something that might have to happen at some point?
Well, not necessarily illegals, but I think they do need to basically tighten up the temporary visa system. So, we have this blowout in bridging visas, etc. They need to clear that. Yep. And they also need to make it a lot harder for someone just to, do a spurious claim for asylum to stay in the country for another, 2 to 3 years while they await their, appeal at the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. So, the whole system needs to be tightened because at the moment it's been massively gamed.
Yeah, not working.
The immigration system. It's not working.
Now, budget deficits, I fear that if you and I are talking in the next 3, 5, maybe even longer years, we're going to be talking about budget deficits.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we're in a bit of a fool's paradise in Australia. So, the mid-year economic fiscal update that came out this week showed that we're going to have it projected basically a decade of budget deficits. And the reason why I say we've been in a fool's paradise is when the Albanese government was elected, it basically got kissed on the backside by a massive windfall in budget revenue that was unexpected. So Russia invaded Ukraine, and what that did was it drove up commodity prices. So pretty much everything Australia sells to the rest of the world, we're talking oil, gas, iron ore, etc., all the natural resources that we sell, it drove those prices up, and it meant that the federal government got flooded in company tax receipts. Then also, as I've just mentioned, they got double the amount of net overseas migration that they projected, which lifted personal income tax receipts because more migrants means more people paying income taxes, which means more tax receipts. Of course, the cost of that then falls on the state governments, but the federal government doesn't care about that. And then they also got an added boom in personal income tax receipts from the higher nominal wage growth and inflation. So because you had this inflation spike, wages went up, even though we went backwards after inflation, and that meant that the federal government got higher tax receipts. The problem with it is, Trent, is that all those forces are either fading or they're going to reverse. So
yeah, right.
Commodity prices are now falling, which means you get lower company tax receipts. Immigration's slowing. It's still way too high, but that means you get lower growth in personal income tax receipts. Inflation and wage growth are slowing, which means lower growth in personal income taxes. And the unemployment rate's forecast to rise, which means they're going to be paying more unemployment benefits and less personal income tax receipts. So as a result, they've forecast a decade of deficits, and this all comes at the same time as the spending commitments continue to rise, most notably because of the NDIS. So the NDIS has been growing for the last 5 years or so at 20% per annum. It's cost nearly $50 billion per annum currently, and it's projected to grow to nearly $100 billion annually in a decade. So it's a pretty nasty situation. You've got, stagnating to slightly falling revenues at the same time as your expenses keep going up. And really the only solution here is we need fundamental tax reform. So basically I'm hoping, I don't think it will happen because I don't have much faith in government, but the next government dusts off their 2010 Henry Tax Review and basically undertakes some fundamental tax reform to broaden the tax base away from personal income taxes and hopefully increases our consumption taxes like the GST, and also most importantly, increases the resource taxes. Because despite the fact we get company tax receipts, we get very little else from our massive resource base.
Yeah.
And we are the world's, biggest exporter in coal, second biggest in natural gas, biggest in iron ore. We basically have almost everything the world needs other than oil, and we're a major exporter of everything, but we have very little to show for that outside of just some company tax receipts and a few resource rent taxes. But if you compare what we do compared to what other major commodity exporters do, we earn very little from our resource base. And I'd hope the next federal government can do something about that and mean that we get a fairer return on our resource exports.
Yeah.
Which would also mean we can reduce taxes in other areas like personal income taxes.
Leith, I only became aware of that when I was reading recently. It was a report that I saw recently, the amount of revenue that we bring in, I think it was from natural gas export compared to one of the countries in the Middle East. And then I heard you talking to Luke about it, but that's a perfect example of what you're talking about here, isn't it?
Yeah. So our revenue receipts from the petroleum resource rent tax is pitiful. It's barely grown in 20 years, and whereas at the same time as exports have boomed, revenues have gone up massively. And if you contrast us to Qatar or Norway, so Qatar is the third biggest gas exporter, we're number 2. Norway is a massive oil exporter, and Norway taxes its oil exports at 80%, and it's the country of 5.5 million people.
Tiny country.
Is sitting on a sovereign wealth fund, which has come purely from its oil exports, that is now worth $310,000 US per resident. So effectively, it's got its oil and gas export revenue. The government's taxed it. It's then put its tax into a future fund equivalent, which invests overseas. It's now the biggest shareholder of Microsoft and a whole bunch of other companies. And each Norwegian is sitting on an endowment. If they had to sell it tomorrow and distribute it to Norwegians, they'd get $310,000 roughly US dollars per citizen.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it?
That is what a smart country does. Unfortunately, we have all the resources in the world other than oil, and we don't do any of this stuff. And yet we're looking at 10 years of budget deficits and high energy costs and everything else that we've created here, despite the fact that we are a massive exporter, which just does not make any sense, Trent.
Leith, stay on the line. We're going to take a break. I've got some text messages here I'll read to you when we come back. We'll take a break and back with more. Trent Nikolic filling in for Luke Grant over the summer break. This is Weekends. It's coming up to 33 minutes past 11 in Sydney, 33 minutes past 10 in Brisbane. Leith, I'm reluctant to read this message out to you, mate, because I don't want to give you a headache. But Glenn is saying that you should run the country. Please ask Leith why he doesn't run for the top job. Too sensible.
Thanks for the kind comments. Look, I do often get asked, why don't you get into politics? And the answer is pretty simple. Unfortunately, in order to get anywhere, you've got to be in one of the two major parties.
That's right.
And the problem with it is, as soon as you join one of the two major parties, you've got to toe the party line. And the fact of the matter is, someone like me would get in there and I'd propose all this stuff, it'd get knocked on the head, and then I'd have to go out and do press conferences back in the party line, which I could just never do. Because to be honest, I disagree with a lot of the things that he said on both sides. And someone like me would end up just being stuffed on the backbench, ignored, and then I'd end up having to become an independent or something. So, look, honestly, I get the sentiment, and I've said that to other people. There's another great guy called Matt Barry who does some fantastic, analysis on the Australian economy. He's given a whole bunch of speeches on it. He just nails it every time. And I've said the same to him, and he's, he feels much the same. So it's just, unfortunately, the system we've got here doesn't allow for proper debate on all these issues.
Yeah. Michael's saying, why don't we drop the net zero nonsense and reduce energy cost? I mean, you've said that before. John's saying, who wrote these resource export contracts? We're screwed. The sentiment of Greg here as well. Great segment. So that's you, Leith, not me. Great segment. They say we're the lucky country. I feel for the younger generations. I think a lot of and then of course Diane saying, can Leith become our Elon Musk? I think you're too smart for that as well. But the reality is that the sentiment out there is that government is making these decisions. Even Glenn says that the problem with gas is, go back to the Liberal government. Howard was selling gas to Japan out of Karratha for 4 cents a litre on a long-term contract. It seems like we do better for people overseas than we do for our own Australians living here. Yeah,
we do. But look to the credit of the Western Australian government, in 2004, they actually brought in, required domestic reservations. So 15% of all gas in WA has to be supplied to Western Australians. Now, they export slightly more than the East Coast here, and 15% seems to be enough, and it's given them cheaper gas and electricity prices. But us on the East Coast here, we don't have any domestic reservation. Yeah. And 75% of our gas is exported, mostly to China. And those Gladstone LNG terminals that were set up just over around a decade ago, were set up without any domestic reservation. And we are literally the only gas exporting jurisdiction in the world on the East Coast that doesn't have domestic reservation. Yeah. And that is, it is maddening that you can export 3/4 or something and then charge your own citizens through the nose and pay energy prices that are just obscene. So just last week, we were paying nearly $20 a gigajoule for gas on the East Coast when America's the biggest gas exporter, we're number 2. Americans pay about $2.50 US a gigajoule, which is about $4 Australian. So we're paying roughly 5 times what Americans pay. And American has an America First policy whereby they reserve it for themselves first and then export. Us, we seem to look after everyone else first, or Asia first, and then don't worry about our own citizens. And this is akin to Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, etc., paying $2 a litre for petrol when they're a massive oil exporter. It makes no sense.
We spoke about that last week. Lee, thank you so much for joining us again, and hopefully I'll speak to you again next Saturday, mate. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem, Trent, and Happy New Year if I don't speak to you.
Yeah, Merry Christmas to you, mate. I keep forgetting what's coming up. Merry Christmas to everybody who's listening in as well. Just one quick message too from Jen saying, hi, Trent, if the GST is increased, because Leith and I were talking about that, what happens to people on a lower income who don't earn enough to pay income tax? It's hard as it is. I understand that, Jen. I think what I've always wondered, and you need to speak to a smarter economic brain than mine, but I've always wondered whether we reduced income tax and jacked the GST up so that then if you consume, if you buy things, if you've got the money to buy things, you're paying more GST, but then you simplify the income tax system. I've always wondered whether that'll work. As I said, smarter economic brains than mine.